Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cine 104, History of Motion Pictures, 1945 to present. We are all the way up to class 14 out of 15 classes. That means we're getting pretty close to the end. All of the directors we've been talking about for the last few classes are still working. Some of them have been working for quite a while. Martin Scorsese, since the 1970s, Steven Spielberg since the 1970s. So that's a pretty long career by any standard. Closing in on 50 years. But all of the directors today are much younger. They haven't been going quite for 50 years, maybe 30, something like that. And boy, if you want a career to have in your old age, I would say directing's pretty good. A lot of these directors don't really reach their prime and even win their first Oscar until they get into their maybe 40s or 50s. That's kind of prime time for directors, is somewhere in their 40s and 50s. So it's really a long run if you're good and you manage to stay relevant and especially get funding from the studios. All right, let's dive in. Let's meet some of our directors that are really at the top of their game. Some of them have yet to win their first Oscars. I expect them to do so anytime now. People like David O. Russell. And again, I'm sorry I put that emphasis on Oscars. It really is kind of a sign of respect more than anything else. We already know that these people are great directors. They're already in our textbooks and things like that. And again, there is a long list of directors, possibly one of the best, two of the best ever. Alfred Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick never won a directing Oscar. So let's just remember that's not really the ultimate. It's not really the ultimate for a career, but it's really nice, and everybody that wins them is very, very happy. So we have to take that as kind of a mixed blessing, I guess, on all that. But anyway, I'm sure. These guys and gals are respected in the Hollywood community, that's for sure. Okay, so we've got David O. Russell. He's an American director. And we're going to zero in on American Hustle because it's very interesting. It has two first-person voiceovers. That's the only film that we're going to talk about in this class with that. There are others with even more. People have 3, maybe even 4 interior or internal monologues, as they're sometimes called. But it's pretty darn rare to have more than one. And yeah, this is not the record or anything like that. But it's but it is very unique. And we're going to hear the thoughts. Remember, we're getting in their heads. We're going to hear the thoughts of these two characters right here, Christian Bale and Amy Adams, and what he thinks of her and what she thinks of him. And that's very interesting because they're in a personal relationship. And like we have said before, when we hear their thoughts, sometimes people are doing different things than they're thinking, right? That's kind of interesting to see somebody do one thing and think another. And we also get not just multiple characters what they're thinking, but we get to see what they're thinking of each other. And that is very interesting, I think, as well. We really climb into their heads. It's really something. So we've got some links to some clips from the film that are going to illustrate that and how they meet and what they think of each other upon first meeting and so on. And hustle is one of those words we talked about a little while ago, I think in a previous class, that is a very hard word to translate in most other languages, apparently. Certainly non-European languages like possibly Mandarin or Cantonese, some Chinese languages, things like that. It's a very foreign concept. And so I don't know, maybe I should do a little research and find out how American Hustle was translated into some of these other languages. And then, of course, translated back into English, I guess, for me to know what they did. He has worked with these actors and actresses on numerous occasions, and that's a pretty good lineup. They're all really top-notch actors and actresses. And Christian Bale, Amy Adams, Jennifer Lawrence, Bradley Cooper, Robert De Niro. Not seen in that picture, but that's a pretty darn good group of actors to I guess befriend and decide that you work well together. We've talked about actors and directors pairing up all throughout the entire semester, with some going, I can't even remember the number, but they're up to 7, 8, 9 with like Tim Burton and Johnny Depp and people like that, and Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese. So you must. My feeling is that it's just easier on the director. Okay, I hardly have to direct her. I hardly have to direct him. They know what I want, and it takes a lot of stress off me. I'm guessing that's what they think, and that's why they use them over and over again. And so some of his other films, Three Kings, which takes place during the Gulf War, and The Fighter, and that's where I believe Christian Bale won an Oscar, and Silver Linings Playbook, which is where Jennifer Lawrence won an Oscar, so all sorts of wonderful Oscar wins for all of these people. And there we see even down there on the, I guess this is the DVD, Silver Linings Playbook and The Fighter, and Silver Linings Playbook is a very interesting film. It's about mental health and the Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence characters as a romantic interest, and it is really a lot of fun. It's sort of a comedy drama, I guess you might call it, and so is this one, and that's kind of an interesting way to go. Sometimes I hear them called dramedies, and that's not a bad description. So I've got a link to the just to the trailer for Silver Linings Playbook, but it really, I think, is a good job of describing the film. All right, I hope you went back and watched some of that stuff. I think that's the best way to go before moving on. And here we have one of our newest directors, at least for me, to add to the class, and that is Edgar Wright. He is British and a director. There you go. And he has a very fast action style, editing, cutting, all that sort of thing. Very heavily stylized. He likes to sync action and music together. And there's a really nice documentary on YouTube that I've got linked from Every Frame a Painting. And I've used two in this class because the person that does those I think is really good. It's very insightful, and I think it's really good. And the one on Edgar Wright is on cutting. I think it's on cutting comedy, is what he calls it, and it's quite good. And it sort of has a nice overview of all of Edgar Wright's films. And let's take a look at some of those. The first three there, Shaun of the Dead, of course, taking off on Dawn of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, which is sort of a police comedy, and The World's End, which is, as it says, there's a zombie apocalypse kind of movie, but of course played lighter, much more comedy. And those three films, I've heard them called the Cornetto trilogy, and apparently Cornetto, it's an English or it's a British thing. There are three flavors of ice cream. I maybe here in the U.S. we call it Neapolitan. I'm not sure, but apparently the colors of the ice cream appear in the movies. Maybe I should do a little bit more on that, but I know they're called the Cornetto trilogy, and they are low budget and a lot of fun. And sometimes I think of those films like the Guy Ritchie films, the British underworld movies that he made. He had three of them before he just did The Gentleman, and it's kind of like that. I think for a lot of these directors, when they're forced to work with low budgets, and they just seem more free not worried about studios giving them notes and telling them, "Oh my God, you've got 100 million of our dollars, and please be careful." And why do they have to be so unlikable, or do they have to do this, or do they have to do that? And directors really hate getting notes. I think I talked about this when we talked about George Lucas and why he wanted to take his Star Wars money and shoo the studios away. Um, and I know every single director has to go through it, even Stanley Kubrick. And I really revere Stanley Kubrick, but even he had to deal with studios from time to time. Um, but those three films, those three Guy Ritchie films, and the three Edgar Wright films, and other directors too, that it seems to me their earlier their earlier work just seems um, more personal and more theirs. And sometimes when you have to go through the studio meat grinder, everything kind of gets pulverized and comes out in a certain way. And as an example for Edgar Wright, he was slated to direct a Marvel movie. And we're going to talk about Marvel coming up in just a little bit here, but while we're on Edgar Wright, what the heck? He was going to do, and I think it's a pretty good pairing, he was going to do an Ant-Man movie. And as we know from the two Ant-Man movies, I was going to say Ant-Man movies, they are definitely on the lighter side of the Marvel movies. They're not quite as heavy and dark as, say, the Captain America movies and so on. They're a little lighter the way the Thor movies are. And and he worked on it for quite a while, a year or even two, and storyboarding and all that kind of stuff. And eventually they just, the studio, the Marvel people, came to kind of this realization that we're not quite on the same wavelength, we're not quite in sync, and maybe it would be best if we go our separate ways. And I know that happens in franchise movies from time to time, not all the time, but I know it happened in the Star Wars franchise where they had to let some directors go, and it's happened here, and other times and other places it has happened. Sometimes with funding. Usually everybody makes nice, as they say, and they call it creative differences, and it's probably something like that. I suppose it could be shouting and screaming also, but I think generally calling it creative differences is a pretty good way to go. And they go their separate ways. Nobody wants to be the cause of a director's career decline or anything like that. So usually everybody has nice things to say about the studios and the directors, and we hope to work together again sometime. And it does happen. Sometimes it does happen. They really have big fights, and it's in the press and all that kind of stuff. And then a couple years later, you find the director and the studio working together. And so I guess you got to have really thick skin to work in the industry. People are looking at your work, your personal work, something that really comes from deep inside you. And when they criticize it, it's kind of a person. You know, it's easy to take it personally, I think. And so you have to have kind of thick skin. You know, when somebody says, "You think that's funny?" And you're like, "Well, yeah, I do." So Edgar Wright, yeah, he's got thick skin. He went on to do some of his bigger hits. Baby Driver, certainly his biggest hit, and that's his most recent film. Maybe, who knows? Maybe someday he'll get attached to an Ant-Man movie or a Marvel movie or something like that. Sometimes they go a little bit out on the edge and do something like that, sort of push the envelope. And we've got a director coming up that has been able to do that, and we'll talk about that. And Scott Pilgrim versus the World, based on the graphic novel. And really a fun film, more of an American film than those three British films, but very definitely on the low budget. And it's shot interestingly and edited, and especially with CGI effects, to look like a video game, and with game over and things like that. And Scott Pilgrim has won the power of something or another, and we see his his I don't know, battery pack or something like that, getting filled up and things like that. So that's kind of a fun film. If you like video games and you haven't seen Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, you definitely have to check that one out. And I have a link to that, and I think it gives you a pretty good idea of that style. And then Baby Driver is very definitely action synced to music. He's done it in bits and pieces in other films, The World's End and things like that, but Baby Driver very definitely is synced to the music. The very first scene in the movie is a heist, and it's that was the one that gave him his idea. That song, Bell Bottom Blues, I think it is. It's not the Eric Clapton one, but Bell Bottom something. I'm sorry, I can't remember. That's the one that was running through his head that gave him the idea for the entire movie. So I have a link to that, and it's a lot of fun. And then the very next link is to the very next scene in the movie, which is where the opening credits are. And it's called Coffee Run. And we see Baby, that's, I guess, his nickname, Baby, and the driver of the car. And he's going out on a coffee run. And as he walks, you can watch this now, since you can start and stop the YouTube linked clip. There is graffiti all over the streets that he's walking through. He's just walking 2 or 3 blocks to a coffee shop and then back, with the lyrics to the song that people are singing. And so check that out. If we were in class, I could take my laser pointer and point out all of the graffiti and so on. It's on telephone poles and walls and things like that. And so that's kind of fun if you haven't noticed that before, if you've already seen the movie, if you haven't noticed that before, or if this is your first time, then watch it maybe a couple of times and you'll notice all the, not all, but many of the lyrics to the song right there kind of on the street. And then again, actions being synced to the music. So Edgar Wright, a lot of fun. He's got a bright career in front of him, and I think he's one of the very youngest directors, if not the youngest director. I don't know how old Wes Anderson is, or David O. Russell, but these guys are on the younger side of the whole thing. I don't know if I have any directors in, he might be in his 30s. That's pretty young for a director to be in a history class. Okay, let's move on. And here we have Ang Lee, and he is Taiwanese American or Asian American, and that is pretty darn rare. We've talked about how rare it is to not be a white male. Okay, so every time we have a female or African American or Asian American or anything like that, or Hispanic, we had 3 Hispanic directors with their armfuls of Oscars, but we still have to point that out because it is still out of the norm. And so Ang Lee, Asian American. When I hear him talk, I don't hear an accent. So he must have come here as a child. Most people that arrive in a new country keep their sort of their original accent, unless they're Meryl Streep, who's not a director, but they would keep their sort of their homegrown accent. And I don't hear anything with Ang Lee, so he must have come over as a child with his parents. But apparently, when you look him up, it says Taiwan American. He has 2 Oscars for directing, and that's pretty darn good. That is the most of any active director. Clint Eastwood, Steven Spielberg, Ang Lee. There might be 1 or 2 that I'm missing, but nobody's up to 3 or 4, I don't think. In the past, John Ford had 4, but and a few others had 3, but that's kind of the current limit. And I'm not even going to show one of his 2 directing Oscar movies here, or talk about it, or link to it. I think I linked to some of them, but Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is really his big one from 2000. 10 Oscar nominations, which is an awful lot for a foreign language film. And I don't want to say it's in Chinese because China has dozens of languages. And it would either be Cantonese or, oh, what's the other? Mandarin. Okay, those are the two big languages in China. I think Cantonese is what they speak in Taiwan, and I think Mandarin is more like Beijing. So anyway, I'm not sure on that. Feel free to send me an email if you know for sure. And so American audiences, we are not used to seeing subtitles on the screen. And really, almost nobody is. Our movies, our big Marvel movies, as they travel around the world and as they go to Taiwan and as they go to China and Brazil and Russia, are dubbed. Okay, so we know they're pretty much dubbed. And for a movie with 10 Oscar nominations, it's too bad they couldn't take the time or find the money to dub it. I think it could have made even more money. I remember seeing it in a theater. I was excited. I knew the director, and it had really great reviews. And there was a sign at the box office that said Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is in whatever, Cantonese, and no refunds. And I guess a number of people in the previous days had, come out, hey, it's not in American, and meaning English, and I want my money back. And so the theater, which was a chain theater, it wasn't an art house, it was a chain theater, it was an AMC theater, they put up the sign, it's in Cantonese, and no refunds. So let the buyer beware. And but it's a really action movie, not that much dialogue, really. And so it's a lot of fun, and I've linked to a fantastic fight, the fights, the battles. The first time I saw the movie in a theater, after the very first fight, there was spontaneous applause, and that was really something. You don't get that too often. Spontaneous applause in a, you get that in a live performance if you go to a concert or a play or something, but in a movie theater, spontaneous applause doesn't happen all the time, and it happened after the very first fight, and on the rooftops. And I've linked to another one, actually two other fights, two women, which is very cool, fighting, and then I guess she's the hidden dragon, and fighting sort of the mentor, Chow Yun-fat, and in the bamboo trees, and that's a very exciting battle as well. It really is spectacular. It's wire work, right? They're up on wires. In the past, they would have to get very, very thin wires that wouldn't show up very well on camera. Today, what I understand is they use wires that you can easily see, because that makes them easier to erase digitally. So it might be like orange or something like that, so you can find them easily and erase them. So today, all wire work, and like The Matrix, right? Same thing. And I think the guy who did the action choreography for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is the same guy that did the action choreography for The Matrix. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, a really spectacular film. 10 Oscar nominations is a lot for an English language film, let alone a foreign language film. And it won 4, not the best director or best actor, but probably cinematography and editing would be 2 that I would think that it would win, and maybe a musical score, something like that. So other films by Ang Lee, the 2 Oscar films, there we go, Brokeback Mountain and Life of Pi, both really good films. Life of Pi did quite well in the theaters, partly because it was based on a book that a lot of people read, and I think they wanted to see how it was done, and it was done quite nicely. He's lately, since Life of Pi, Ang Lee has been exploring CGI. There's some excellent CGI in Life of Pi. Really, the bulk of the story is a young uh, South Asian or Indian boy in a life raft with a Bengal tiger. And the Bengal tiger, for the most part, is CGI, and it looks just fantastic. Um, and then the long halftime walk of Billy Flynn was done in high frame rate. And again, I don't want to get too technical here. Film is generally shot at 24 frames per second, and high frame rate would mean like 48 or 60 or something like that. But it's digital, so somehow they transfer or translate uh, actual film frame rate to digital frame rate, and it's supposed to give a very, very sharp image, almost so sharp as to appear to be 3D. And Peter Jackson tried that in the Hobbit films as well. HFR, if you ever see HFR, it means high frame rate, and that's what's going on. And I saw the Hobbit, first of the Hobbits, and I didn't think it was that uh, much better, really. And Ang Lee did the first of the Hulk movies, which is kind of interesting. We're going to be talking about superheroes in just a little bit. And in the Marvel world, I'm not a big comic book geek, but I know enough to know that in the DC world, it's Superman and Batman. Those are the big, big stars. Superman especially, and Batman lately are the big stars. And in the Marvel world, it's Spider-Man and Hulk. Spider-Man and Hulk. It's not Iron Man. It's not Thor. It's not any of that. It's really Spider-Man and Hulk. If you were to ask people maybe 5 or 10 years ago to name a Marvel person, it would be Spider-Man and Hulk, and then probably Fantastic Four. Okay, and way down the list would be all those other characters. Even Captain America and so on. Those are way down the list of the famous Marvel characters. And it's kind of killing Marvel that they can't seem to get a Hulk franchise going. They've tried twice for origin stories, solo origin story effort. And they just can't do it. So Hulk seems to be okay as part of an ensemble in all those Avengers movies. He seems to fit in quite nicely and quite well, and Mark Ruffalo does fantastic work, but he can't seem to have his own franchise, and that's very disconcerting, befuddling to the Marvel people. They can't quite figure out why they can't do that, but I think they've kind of settled on Hulk being with someone else, I guess. They can't quite carry a movie on his own. And then Gemini Man, and we're going to talk about Gemini Man later on, because Will Smith was de-aged substantially to play two versions of himself in the movie. His current age, I'm sure he's in his 50s, and then they de-aged him back to somewhere in his 20s when he was like Men in Black, very first Men in Black, something like that. So we'll talk about him later on when we get into CGI. Okay, so one of those directors that has done a superhero movie but is an auteur, and that is Christopher Nolan. And it has, sometimes it works just fine. The very first one to do that really is Tim Burton, and he did the very first two Batman movies. And they were huge hits. They made tons and tons of money back in the 80s. So if you're thinking that superhero movies kind of got kicked off somewhere around the 2000s with Avengers and Justice League and X-Men, then you're off by about 20 some years. And I would say much earlier than that. Witness the Tim Burton. The two Tim Burton movies. They made two more after that weren't quite so good, but the two Tim Burton movies made tons and tons of money, and they were really quite good. So, Batman, the Dark Knight trilogy, as they're called, and until very recently, the most famous of the Joker was the Heath Ledger Joker, and he was nominated and won Best Supporting Actor until recently. Okay, so apparently the Joker's a great character. I guess that there's Oscars going out to everybody that plays the Joker. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, Christopher Nolan. Psychological themes of identity, and we certainly get that in Batman. He's very definitely this rich playboy and this Dark Knight. And let's get a list of his films. There we go. He has that enviable career, like Steven Spielberg and a few others, but I would say Steven Spielberg right there, to be able to do the popular, like the Batman movies, and the artistic, like really a lot of his movies right there, The Prestige and Inception and Interstellar and Dunkirk. And he's really managed, this is really amazing, to do big budget non-franchise movies. I'm not talking about the Batman movies, but with Dunkirk and Interstellar and Inception, those are big budget movies that did quite well at the box office. And that is just unheard of. It's just unheard of to do a big movie like that, $100 million budget with a really hard to sell story. Really hard to sell, and right there, much difficulty with marketing, difficult concepts. Now, he started with Memento, but that was a really low-budget movie, and it's told backwards. It's very interesting. It's not told literally with the words coming out of, it's not like that. But the very first scene in the movie is the very last chronological scene, and then the very next scene in the movie is the scene that would come before that. Okay, so backwards in that way with scenes, 5-minute scenes told backwards. And if you think about it, as a director and a co-screenwriter, I think his brother wrote the original story and then they worked together on the screenplay, you still have to think about your audience in the theater, and that they have to follow some kind of a plot, that, we are all stuck in time. We have to go forward, okay? Time's arrow only goes forward for us. It can go backwards in any which direction in movies, but it can only go forward for us. So somehow he's going to tell this film scene by scene backwards, and yet there has to be some kind of a plot. Okay, and it works. It works. It's amazing. It works. So if you are interested in challenging stuff, check out Memento. It's really quite an amazing movie. Prestige, with turn of the last century magicians. Very interesting film, very challenging. And then we get Inception, and that's the film that I would have links and things to, the dream world and all of that. And I mean, there's a lot of weird rules in Inception. If you don't remember it, there's a lot of weird rules about 5 minutes in the dream world is equal to an hour in the real world, something like that. And the only way you can come out of the dream world is to be killed, and lots of weird rules and stuff that don't make any sense. They don't make any sense whatsoever. But it's a great movie. It's a really great movie. And he does that. And he does it again in Interstellar. He does it again in Interstellar with, it's science and stuff, and how time passes so much slower when you're near places of heavier gravity and things like that. And again, I don't know if you want to think about it too hard or not. I went online and looked up some stuff about Interstellar. I love all that, black hole and space and all that kind of stuff. And they got top-notch people to help to help keep the science right and in order. But it's a very challenging movie. And if you like Interstellar, you should check out 2001. And if you like 2001, you should check out Interstellar. They're both good movies, challenging, and so if you like a challenge and like to be entertained and amazing visuals and all the rest of it, then those two movies are a good double feature, that's for sure. And then with Dunkirk, which is very interesting too, in its in its timeline. He's got 3 stories that he's telling, and one story takes a week, one story takes a day, and one story takes an hour. Okay, and this is during the evacuation of British forces from Dunkirk in France. They have been overrun by the Nazis on their first attempt at war. There, they land all their troops, and they're at war, just like World War I. They think it's going to be another war like World War I, but they totally get overrun, and they're huddled practically on the beach at Dunkirk, hoping for rescue from ships and boats and things like that. And they don't quite have enough troop ships. They can't, they can't carry all those troops on a couple of troop ships. Plus, the other thing with troop ships is they need a deep harbor, and Dunkirk does not have a deep harbor, so they have to be ferried out to troop ships and things like that. All sorts of interesting challenges. So, amazingly, the British sent people in recreational craft. Okay, anything that could cross the English Channel, it's only 20 some miles or so, they were asked to go over and bring back soldiers, and they did. And it was really amazing. The British all know about it. Here in the U.S., we're not quite so big on the parts of World War II that we weren't a part of. And but it's a big deal in Britain. And Christopher Nolan wanted to highlight that for us Yanks, and he did, and he intercut those 3 stories, the week story, the day story, and the hour story, quite nicely, and it really builds. All 3 of them build quite nicely, and so it's a really interesting way to edit. It really is. If you're interested in editing and study editing, really you have to check out Dunkirk. And kind of interesting because it's not a fantasy sci-fi. It's not a Batman movie. It's not a Inception or Interstellar type movie. It's a very much old-fashioned World War II movie, and it's great, right? Christopher Nolan can do anything. They're all big budget movies, widescreen, all that, IMAX, and so on, and shot on film. There's the IMAX camera right there. I'm shooting film, all that stuff. So really, today, he's kind of one of a kind. He really is. There aren't that many directors that can do. Probably Spielberg can do it, I guess. And I would say he already has with Saving Private Ryan, which is a big budget, thoughtful movie, very thoughtful movie, but not really a franchise or anything like that. So another World War II movie too. That's another one that you would pair that up with Dunkirk. So these poor marketing departments in the studio system, how to sell something where somebody is in somebody else's dream. Okay, how are you going to sell that? And Interstellar, where time is bending and being very elastic. How do you sell that stuff? And really, one of the key ways, it's not the only way, but one of the key ways is starring. Okay, there's Leo from the director of, and there's Christopher Nolan, and that's how you do that. And Leo has been kind of a part of that. If you're a really big star, people will go to see Leonardo DiCaprio movies, no matter what he does, right? Because everybody's loved Leo since Titanic, so they will see Leo crawl across, the tundra and all of that. As wounded by a bear, and practically anything else he does, he can get people to see these really challenging films, and that's really the way, right? From the director of The Dark Knight, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, and people will go to see those kinds of movies. And if we think about The Martian, here's a guy on Mars. There's no aliens. There's nothing. It's dead planet, and he's abandoned accidentally, and he has to live and and farm in his own poo and all that kind of stuff. And who wants to see that movie? You know, that doesn't sound like sci-fi or anything like that. But it's got Matt Damon and directed by Ridley Scott, and that's how you sell a movie like that. I was trying to think. I'm sorry, I was trying to think of Leo's movie. The Revenant was the movie crawling across the tundra and the whatever, the snow and all that. Revenant. Do a quick blank on that. Anyway, that's what you have. And if you're lucky, if we are lucky as an audience and we have directors who like to go out and take a chance, then maybe a Christopher Nolan or maybe Alfonso Cuarón or maybe even a Tim Burton, somebody like that. Steven Spielberg, we might see movies that are very challenging like that because Steven Spielberg can make a movie with Tom Hanks and maybe people will go see it, right? Everybody loves Tom Hanks. People know Steven Spielberg. They're not so sure about Bridge of Spies, which is a pretty good movie, and maybe some of the other movies that he's done, but that's what the marketing department is going to get stuck with, I think. Okay, so I think we got a couple more directors, but we're getting pretty close to the present. We're pretty close to the present here, and Peter Jackson, and you'll notice these last few here with Christopher Nolan and Peter Jackson, heavier on CGI and things like that, and that's kind of the direction that the movie business is going these days with the big budget movies, if it's a big budget movie. Peter Jackson, he's from New Zealand, and he did 3 Lord of the Rings movies, and King Kong, and then 3 Hobbit movies, trilogy, 3, and very interestingly, Lord of the Rings, LOTR, Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films were shot all 3 at once over about a year, because they're big movies. They're like 3 hours each, times 3. It's like, 9, almost 10 hours of movies. And the director's cut, it's like 11 or 12 hours of movie there on DVD and so on. And so shot for like a year, and then took a whole year, because a lot of CGI, very CGI heavy, a whole year to put out the first one, and then another year to put out the second, and another year to put out the third, and that's the only way you can put out a 3-hour movie every year. Normally, if you're looking at even Harry Potter movies and Avengers movies, it's going to be 2 or 3 years apart. And the only way they could do, the 2 Avengers movies is they shot them simultaneously like that, and then edited them separately. Big movies tend to take years to do, months and months and months to shoot, and then months and months of CGI and editing and all of that. And so both of those trilogies, Lord of the Rings, once they were done with a year of shooting and a year of editing, then they could pop out the first movie, edit for a year, and the second, and the third, and so on. And so they were all shot together, edited separately, and they all, well, not quite all of the Hobbit movies. Andy Serkis played Gollum in the 2, he's not really in the first one, in 2 of the Lord of the Rings movies and the very first of the Hobbit movies, so I guess 3 altogether. And he is really the go-to guy for motion capture, mocap, motion capture acting, and he has even been called in as an advisor on Avengers movies and some other movies, because he really knows the whole mocap thing and how to act for mocap, really, for these strange creatures and things like that. And he did King Kong too, and he's done other. He was good enough for Kong, so they tapped him. Not Peter Jackson, but they tapped him for the Planet of the Apes movies, and he played Caesar. And he did some second unit directing on the Hobbit films, and he's done some acting as himself too. He'll never be, I don't think he'll ever be a lead actor, but as a character actor, they'll call him in to play the interesting parts of the movies. Steven Spielberg even pulled him in on Adventures of Tintin, again, another motion capture movie. But he kind of looks, he's motion capture as a sort of a cartoon character, but he kind of looks like a little bit, well, maybe not. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that. It's more cartoony. He does some live action stuff in the King Kong movie. Okay, so check some of that stuff out. There's a nice scene, by the way, that I've got of Andy Serkis as Gollum, and it's a very interesting scene because Peter Jackson is going to shoot him and do something called crossing the line. And generally, when you're shooting an actor, you stay on one side of a 180-degree line so that screen direction is preserved, which means you run from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and you face the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. If you're talking with somebody else, then they are facing the other side, right? And you sort of cut back and forth, and audiences understand the screen direction. And Peter Jackson, he crossed it on purpose, and so when it's edited together, it looks like Gollum is talking to another character. There's Smeagol and Gollum, and he's kind of schizophrenic. He has a split personality, and his voice changes just ever a little bit. Really nice acting on Andy's part, and as the Smeagol sort of meek, nicer part of his embedded personality, and then as Gollum, sort of the one that's been corrupted by the ring, I guess we would say. And Peter shoots it. It's the first time he takes the camera and he dollies from one side of the screen to the other, and so that we know that it's just one character. And then he cuts back and forth, and when you watch it, it looks like two people are talking to each other. And really, it's Gollum talking to himself, and he's disturbed and so on, and I guess modern science would call it schizophrenic. So look for that. It's a very, very interesting scene there of poor Gollum and his interior trauma. Okay, our last two films, and next class we're going to do CGI, which is going to cover a lot of this stuff, motion capture and all of that. But our last couple of films, really historically, I wanted to talk a bit about Bong Joon-ho. There are other films that have won Oscars these last 2, 3, 4 years, but this is really in the history books because it's the first Best Picture Oscar in a foreign language, and that's historical, and I thought we should mention it. He's a very interesting director. He doesn't tend to do really big, tight budget movies, action and things like that. Parasite is the film that won. I think the whole idea of class struggle is the main thing that got people interested in it. Very upper class people and very lower class people who live even in an apartment halfway below ground, and it tends to flood every once in a while and things like that. So we have literally the lower class people low in a basement apartment, this awful place, and then the rich people literally on the hilltop with their beautiful mansion, modern mansion overlooking the city of, I assume it's Seoul, South Korea, down below. So literally the upper classes and literally the lower class, and done in a very interesting, lots of twists and turns. I love that. I love being surprised, and this movie has lots of good surprises and things like that. So that is a real first. Also for screenplay and directing and international. They're calling foreign language films now international films. And again, without again too deep into the whole Oscar thing, he was a good director before he won his Oscar. I don't know that it made him a better director, but the Academy symbolically doing that was a very big deal. It was a very big deal. Lots of fantastic movies over the years have been in languages other than English. Okay, we're aware of all the wonderful British movies, Lawrence of Arabia and James Bond and all that, but lots of amazing movies. Fellini with his amazing Italian movies, and Kurosawa with his amazing Japanese movies. Never won, right? Never won Best Picture. They won Best Foreign Language Film, but they didn't win Best Picture. And Ingmar Bergman and Swedish. I mean, so many all-time classic directors. I've only named a couple. Antonioni. There's so many that have done amazing work, never honored by the Academy. It's not the American Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. It's just the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And yes, it's headquartered in Los Angeles, Hollywood, but they have never honored a foreign language film before. This is the first one to do that. He has worked in English a couple of times. Snowpiercer, which is kind of sci-fi, set on a train, traveling through a frozen over Earth. Okay, traveling around the planet. This amazing train track. Okay, kind of sci-fi. This amazing train track traveling over the planet endlessly, with classes in railroad cars. So the first class people are toward the front and the lower class people are toward the back. Again, very interesting stuff. And that one has been available back and forth on Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or something like that. So look for that. And then he did another film, Okja, for Netflix, I believe. And that one is in English too. Both of those are in English. The Host is kind of a horror film. So he's a little bit fantastical. Parasite, kind of the most down to earth of his films in a little while, and well worth a look. So the very newest and brand newest of our directors here, and really breaking that barrier, right? And all those Oscars. And this last film, it's really an amazing technical achievement, and I wanted to talk about that. Sam Mendes has done some James Bond movies, 2 James Bond movies, and he won an Oscar for directing American Beauty. But this is really more about Roger Deakins and the amazing work that he did. Of course, he did his work under the direction of Sam Mendes, so we don't want to dilute any of that, right? They really are working together as a team. But the stuff that Deakins did for this film, this is done also as one very long take, just like Birdman, but Birdman takes place for the most part in a building and on the sidewalks outside that building in the theater district in New York, and it's a great movie. But this one is really times 10. It's a World War I film. Lots of trenches, trench warfare is what they had in World War I for the most part. They pushed until they got as far as they could get, and then they dug trenches and put up barbed wire and just shot at each other for years. And the Germans got this, mostly was in Belgium and northern France, and it just went almost from the Atlantic to I don't know, not the Mediterranean, but it goes all the way across Europe like that. This awful, amazing war, 100 years and a couple. And so there are 2 young British soldiers, and somehow intelligence has found out that the Germans are lying in wait. They have sort of appeared to be on the run, and there is I'm not sure the size, I don't know if it's a battalion or whatever, but there are thousands and thousands of British troops. They're ready to attack at dawn, and they are going into a meat grinder. The Germans are there waiting for them, and the 2 fairly low-level British, I don't know, corporals or sergeants or something, have a message, and conveniently, just like in today's movies, when all of a sudden there's no cell phone reception, okay, for the plot of a movie, they're in wherever, and the awful bad guys can't, or the good guys can't phone for help because there's conveniently bad cell phone reception. We see that in movies all the time, taking place in the last 20 years or so. And so here, back then, during World War I, they had, for the most part, strung communication lines, wires, just along the ground, but that's how they could communicate. And they have been cut. Okay, so they have been conveniently cut. And so these two young British soldiers have to run, almost literally run, through trenches and other things and fields and caves and all sorts of places. And it is such a technical achievement. Toward the end, he's running through at night. There's a sort of a bombed out village, and he jumps into the river, and it goes floating down the river for a while. How they got that shot is amazing, and you will see how they got it, because I've linked to a wonderful how they did it YouTube clip, and sort of behind the scenes doc, like we used to only get on DVDs. Now they're putting them up on YouTube more and more frequently. So you'll get to see how they did that, and it's really something. And Roger Deakins has done a lot of work with the Coen brothers. I love the Coen brothers, and Roger Deakins' work was quite good. He had unfortunately, he had the dishonor, I don't know, of having, 8 or 10 nominations without a win. And then last year he won, or maybe it was 2 years ago, I guess it was a couple years ago, he won for Blade Runner 2049, and everybody's very, very happy because Roger, had all these, like a dozen nominations with no wins. And now 2 years later, he gets his second one. So way to go, Roger. Really quite an amazing feat. And check out that, How They Did It documentary. So we're going to talk about the business of show business, the business of movies here, as current as we can get. U.S. studio profits are 30% from the U.S. and Canada. Canada's kind of considered domestic. Sometimes they say North American, but that's not quite right because it doesn't include Mexico because they don't speak English in Mexico. As a matter of fact, they don't even speak English in all of Canada because there's Quebec where they speak French. But anyway, 30% domestic box office, 70% foreign. And so movies are made with big movies are made with a world audience in mind. How are they going to like this movie in China and Russia and Brazil and Africa, right? And everywhere else. And so that's why we get these big action movies. They're the easiest to market. Okay, chasing and fighting. I mean, who can't understand that? There's more to it than that. But, basically, Fast and Furious, James Bond, Harry Potter, Avengers, of course, Marvel, DC. That's what the world audience wants to see. Comedy is tough, right? Because slang, we talked about slang and so on. All those Seth Rogen movies, they barely know who Seth Rogen is overseas. Barely know who he is. The humor is very American. It's very American humor. And it's hard to translate that to, far off cultures and things. So people like Seth Rogen are not big international stars the way the action stars are. I shouldn't have picked on Seth Rogen, but actually it's not bad. He's a very American, very funny, all that. Love his stuff, but it just doesn't really work overseas so well. So we'll call it 90% of U.S. films are projected digitally. If there's a question on a test, we'll go for the 90 as the correct answer, and 91% or 90% of U.S. films are shot with digital cameras. That's a digital projector right there. And here we see how film is projected. Apparently this theater is ready. They can slide this over if they've got a film to show. But for the most part, movies are with digital projectors and things like that. And that has changed quite a bit in about 10 years or so, 10 or 11 years. It was probably almost the reverse. It was probably like 10% projected digitally and 90% projected on film, maybe 10, 11, 12 years ago, something like that. So quite a reverse in the last, certainly since the Star Wars movies of the early 90s, and even since Avatar, when Avatar came out in 08, 09, I think it was. They didn't really have enough digital projectors to show it in 3D. Digital cameras also making a big claim on the marketplace. There are directors like Christopher Nolan who says he will shoot on film till his dying day, but that they are few and far between. So few films are shot. Really? Did you hear that? So few films. Okay, so few movies. Okay, and we're going to be calling them films forever, even though they're not. There's no film. There's no film, but we'll still call them films, I guess. Are shot with film cameras, and but we'll call them movies, but we'll call them films. And Kodak was ready to go out of business. They didn't. They weren't processing enough and selling enough actual Kodak film, and the studios had to sort of bail them out. They sort of said, please, we still have directors that like to shoot, and there's some of our big directors like Christopher Nolan, and some people go back and forth. Steven Spielberg goes back and forth, film, digital, but some directors still want to shoot with film, and so Kodak kind of got bailed out by the studios. Otherwise, boy, you're up to 91%. Maybe it's 92 or 93 by now, and that's how you go out of business. But Kodak and some of the others, maybe Fuji, they're still around. This chart is really amazing. It is so perfect. Really, it's so perfect. Now, okay, first off, I don't know tape. Okay, I don't get that, because digital is digital. I don't know how many people would shoot on videotape, so I would just get rid of this one down here altogether. But film, okay, here we are, 2000, and up and down, up and down, up and down, pretty, where are we? 2008, right around Avatar, 2009, okay, 10, 11, and look at that, right here, and with digital, hardly any, back when George Lucas is doing The Phantom Menace and all that, one of the very only few films shot with digital cameras, things like that. We'll talk about that when we talk about CGI. Hardly any. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They start coming up. 2005, 6, 7. Okay. And kind of sharp here. 9, 10. Like I said, right around Avatar and things like that. And right here, what is that? March of 2012. Okay. February of 2012. 2012. There we go. Film and digital cross. Right? They meet. They have the same amount of movies are shot on film, and the same amount of movies are shot digitally in 2012. And then it's sharp up, flatten out a little bit, and up, and now we're into the 90+%. Apparently it's 91, 92%. And film is down, okay, and diving, that's a straight line, right? 2 years later, I'm sure they're down to that 9% there, or whatever it is. Okay, so this graph, it tells a story brilliantly. Okay, really tells a story brilliantly. Okay, so a couple business terms. Platforms is how a product gets put out. Okay, so for movies, films, theaters, broadcast, streaming, games, internet, and so on. Okay, that would be the platforms. And you might, in the business section, you might hear that, they're doing a multi-platform release. Okay, and speaking of the business section of your newsfeed or of the newspaper or whatever, that is a pretty good career path. If you like movies and you're not a cinema film major, this is a really good career path. You can sort of work with movies and work in business. And the producers crew, the producers team takes care of a lot of that stuff. They do the contracting, they do the reserving. They have to get all the contracts and stuff for everybody. They have to get the clearances. They're working on the scripts and things like that. Under the producers team, they have security. They have to hire security. They have to get shooting permits to block off the street. All that stuff, right? All that stuff. Now, they're not shooting and they're not editing, okay? They're not doing the production stuff. But the producers team, under the producer, they're doing all that other stuff. And there's a ton of jobs under the producer. Now, I know producer and production, they're so close together. Sorry, I wish there was another word. I really do. I wish there was a better word for, producers team. In television, they call them the showrunner. That sort of helps a little bit. But in the movie film studio world, the producer track and all the assistant producers and all that, from the low level, minimum wage, go get me a cup of coffee, all the way up to the people, funding multi-million-dollar movies. Okay, that all comes under the producers team, and it is a good career path. And if you like the entertainment industry, television, right, movies, all that, but you don't really think you have a skill of lighting and shooting and editing and sound and all that, then there is a whole another career path for you. So anyway, keep that in mind. Okay, and those are platforms. A couple more terms here for us. Theatrical window. This is a big hot term right here, the theatrical window. How long from theaters to basically everything else? Okay, how long does that take? And that is getting upset. Okay, that is getting disrupted, very disruptive force. Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Disney Plus and HBO Plus is coming up soon, and NBC has the Peacock, and all that stuff. Okay, Netflix is going 30 days or less. Okay, and the theater owners don't like it. Normal is 3 months. 3 months, 1/4 of a year. That's normal. Okay, and that's the way it's been, and that's the business. Okay, go all the way back to Charlie Chaplin, 1920s. That is the business. And theaters are part of the film industry. And now theaters are kind of getting elbowed a little bit aside. And that is pretty darn disruptive, really, to think that you could have a film industry without theaters. Okay, I don't know if that day's coming or not, but with Netflix, now Amazon's not doing this. Amazon's being nicer to the theaters and stuff, and they're making movies, but they're keeping the 90-day theatrical window before they release it. They're not releasing it to their Amazon Prime streamers. But Netflix has done a couple. Okay, that is The Irishman, and last year we had Roma. Both of those movies were nominated for Best Picture. A few others with nominations and things like that. So that's a big thing. Okay, remember that. That's a very big thing. So Best Picture nominations. There we go. Roma from Alfonso Cuarón. The Irishman from Martin Scorsese. I think Marriage Story is another one. I'm sorry, I don't have that up there. I think Marriage Story from this year also was nominated for Best Picture. And I wonder if there was another one. But those are the two big ones. There's probably a couple others. And the Coen brothers even did it. They were making kind of a Western, The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. They couldn't find funding. It was an anthology, which means it was 6 short stories sort of packaged together into a 2-hour theatrical experience, I guess you call it. And so even the Coen brothers went the Netflix route. Day and date. is when a film is available in theaters and home on the same day. Netflix hasn't quite gone that far yet. They kept a 30-day window before The Irishman and Roma came out. And a few are playing with that. During the virus, studios are fast tracking movies to streaming, movies that didn't do so well in theaters, and then the theaters closed down during the virus. And so who knows, right? Who knows? Day and date movies, or movies that are released at home on home video very fast, are like $19, and a lot of people are like, well, that's way high, right? Why would I spend $19? And all the rest of my streaming is less than that for everything, and now you want me to spend $19 on one film? It would have to be a pretty big film before a lot of people. It would have to be a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie or some really big movie, I think, before a lot of people said, okay, $19 isn't bad because 5 of us are going to watch it. So that's not bad, right? We'll spend the $19, we'll all chip in, everybody can chip in $4 or $5, and we'll all watch the new Star Wars movie or the new Avatar movie or something like that. I don't think it's going to happen with Avatar. James Cameron really likes theaters and 3D and all that. So that's not going to happen with Avatar. But it would have to be a really big movie before a day and date film, I think, at $19 or $20 was a big deal. So we have 5 big media conglomerates, because I can't do this right now, but I would do a drag and drop. Okay, I would select all of these and drop them over here under Disney. And because Disney picked up Fox, not Fox News, but they've got 20th Century Fox, the Fox ones. I'm not sure if they have Blue Sky or not, but the movies, okay, would be over here under Disney, to go with like everything else. Hard to tell. There's the Disney movies, of course. Pixar, Marvel, that's Lucasfilm. It's hard to see, but that's Lucasfilm. They have Muppets and so on, and Touchstone, which is sort of their non-PG Disney movies, maybe PG-13, maybe R under Touchstone, and all of that. Okay, and so there we have assets from 20th Century Fox, but basically drag and drop that over there. 5 media conglomerates these days, and that means we're getting most of our entertainment from just 5 companies. That's really an oligopoly, right? Very, very few. And who knows, right? Who knows the future? CBS sort of just reformed. CBS and Showtime were separate. Now they've been reformed. They were one company, and then 2 companies, and then one company again. Comcast is with NBC. Disney is with ABC, so we see that they are working together with TV networks and things like that, which are becoming, I know, slightly more irrelevant these days. I know a lot of people barely watch over-the-air TV, but anyway, there's that. Warner, HBO, and all that. So they are aligned with television as well, but not broadcast television. So consolidation is the key. It's really a lot of consolidation. So sci-fi tends to use allegory. We have Animal Farm, 1984, things like that. So allegory is a key in all this. Reboot is a key in all this. So many movies have been rebooted, and I wanted to mention the whole allegory thing because in X-Men 2, if you go to YouTube, it actually says so-and-so's coming out, and the whole scene plays like one of those after-school specials of a young teen announcing to his or her parents that they are gay, and they play it just like that, only they are telling their parents that they are a mutant. So that's very interesting, and I think I have a link to that clip from X-Men 2, and Sci-Fi does that quite well, really. And stuff on domestic spying, all sorts of things like that in Avengers movies and DC movies and so on. So in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'm sure you're aware of all of this, and that list is not complete. But that is the Marvel, that what they call the Cinematic Universe. They've ended one big major story, their 2021 film Avengers series. So where they go next, they're on a new path. And the other key comic book series was DC, and they really were in the lead for the longest time. Superman was big. Superman was in on serials in the 1930s and 1940s. There were Batman serials in the 30s and 40s. There was a Superman radio program, the Superman television show in the 1950s. The two Superman, the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, which were so big in the 70s and 80s. The Batman movies with Tim Burton were so big, so they had a huge lead. The point is, they had a huge lead. Marvel was just doing these awful Spider-Man TV shows and Hulk TV shows, and they were just an afterthought. They really were just an afterthought, all the way up to 2000, actually about 2005, 2006, something like that. X-Men came out, I think it was 2001 or 2, but DC is definitely number 2 at this point to Marvel, and that's for sure. Interestingly, though, DC has always done better on television than Marvel has. And there's, okay, just in case you don't know, okay, I shouldn't assume everybody is a comic book fan. Wonder Woman doing quite well, okay, that's a big thing for them, and Aquaman did pretty well. A lot of people thought the DC movies were too dark on the dark side. Not just the Superman movie, but certainly Superman, Batman, and Justice League were kind of dark. Poor DC, because they had such huge hits with the Dark Knight trilogy. Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight movies, there's barely a laugh in all those movies. There's barely a laugh. They were so popular. Everybody loved The Dark Knight. Oh my God, we have to nominate these movies for Best Picture. All that kind of stuff. And they were dark and brooding and all that. And they tried to keep it, right? They tried to make more dark Batman movies, more dark Superman movies, all that. It just didn't work. Everybody loved the Marvel movies. Everybody loved the jokiness. Oh, look at the way Captain America and Iron Man are bickering and so on and joking, and Thor, and how much fun they are, right? They were fun movies, and they were doing so much better at the box office than the DC movies were. So DC has definitely lightened it up. Aquaman and Wonder Woman, definitely lighter. They're not quite as light as Ant-Man, but definitely lighter. Better on television. Supergirl, Green Arrow, Lantern, Flash, all that stuff. They're definitely doing better on television. But that last, way down there at the bottom, there we go, Joker and Suicide Squad, and that's the very last thing to talk about. The new R-rated graphic novel comic book films. And when I asked my class, they come up with even more than that. There are quite a few graphic novels and comic book movies, but these are the key ones. And Deadpool had the record. They did quite well. Ryan Reynolds very graciously sent a note to the Joker people that you did it, right? We had the R-rated crown, and they did. Joker did quite well. I don't know, $1 billion at the box office. Really amazing stuff. But Watchmen on television, from graphic novels, Blade, Spawn, Kick-Ass, Kingsman, right? Maybe you forgot about those, but those are R-rated, and that is kind of a new trend. Logan's quite good, by the way. If you haven't seen Logan, that's Wolverine's, I guess, his human name. And that is kind of one of the last of our trends. Our very last class is going to be kind of an overview of CGI, which is so important in all of these movies, not just the superhero movies, but even James Bond movies and Fast and Furious movies, and then of course fantasy movies, Harry Potter and Star Wars and all that. So it's kind of a big thing. I will do a last class as a history of CGI. You can look forward to that. In the meantime, that is it for class 14, Cine 104, History of Motion Pictures, 1945 to present. This is Professor Dave Eccles signing off. See you next time.